The map room in the Reich Chancellery. Late June 1944. Heinz Guderian, newly appointed Chief of the General Staff, stood before the Eastern Front map with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the red markers that had multiplied like a disease across Army Group Center's sector. His fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from the rage he was suppressing. In 3 days, the Soviets had torn a hole in the German line so vast that entire divisions had simply ceased to exist. 28 divisions. Gone. And Hitler, sitting at the conference table behind him, was talking about counterattacks. Guderian said, keeping his voice level, he had learned, in his months away from active command, that directness with Hitler was a gamble. Sometimes the Führer respected it. Sometimes it meant dismissal. But the situation was beyond diplomatic language now. Hitler's response was to slam his hand on the table, not in anger at the situation, but at Guderian for stating it plainly. Defeatism, Hitler said, has destroyed more armies than the enemy ever could. This was the new reality for German commanders in the summer of 1944. The professional military assessment of what was actually happening on the ground had become indistinguishable from defeatism in Hitler's mind. And so the men who had spent their entire adult lives studying warfare, who understood terrain and logistics and force ratios, found themselves trapped between what they knew and what they were permitted to say. Operation Bagration had begun on June 23rd, and within 72 hours, the Soviet forces had achieved something the German General Staff had believed impossible. They had encircled multiple German armies simultaneously. Not through some brilliant tactical innovation, but through overwhelming force applied at multiple points at once. The Soviets had learned. They had learned from their disasters of 1941 and 42, learned from German methods, and now they were applying those lessons with the kind of material superiority that made tactical brilliance almost irrelevant. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, who commanded Army Group Center when the offensive began, had spent the first 48 hours in a state of disbelief. His intelligence officers had warned him. They had shown him the reconnaissance reports, the prisoner interrogations, the aerial photographs of Soviet forces massing across a front of over 400 miles. But the scale of what was coming seemed so enormous that Busch had convinced himself it must be a deception. The main attack, he reasoned, would come somewhere else. This was just a diversion. He was wrong, and by the time he understood how wrong, his army group was already dying. Walter Model arrived to replace Busch on June 28th, and what he found was beyond salvage. Model, who had earned the nickname Quote Sauteau for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts, walked into the headquarters and spent 6 hours reviewing the situation reports. Then he picked up the phone to call Hitler's headquarters. The conversation, later recorded in Model's papers, was brief. Model said, "The response from Hitler's headquarters was predictable. No withdrawals. Every position to be held." Model, who, unlike many of his peers, was willing to push back against Hitler, tried a different approach. "My Führer, if we do not withdraw now, we will lose not just the territory, but every remaining soldier in the salient. We are not trading space for time. We are simply losing both." He got his authorization, but it came too late. By the time Model's orders reached the front, entire divisions had been encircled. The Soviet pincers had closed around Minsk by July 3rd. Approximately 300,000 German soldiers were cut off. Some would fight their way out. Most would not. In the West, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge was experiencing his own revelation. The Normandy front, which had held the Allies in the Bocage country through June and into July, suddenly collapsed in late July. The American breakout at St. Lo, Operation Cobra, punched through German lines and then turned the corner into open country. Within days, American armored columns were racing across France faster than German units could retreat. Kluge's situation reports to Hitler's headquarters became increasingly desperate in tone. On August 7th, he wrote, He was describing divisions that had been reduced to regimental strength, regiments the size of battalions, battalions that were merely companies. The organizational chart said Army Group B controlled multiple panzer divisions. The reality was, a few dozen tanks scattered across a front that was dissolving. Hitler's response was to order Klug to launch a counterattack at Mortain, driving west to cut off the American breakthrough. Klug, reading this order, understood immediately that it was impossible. He had neither the forces, nor the fuel, nor the air cover to accomplish anything except the destruction of what little armored strength remained. But he also understood that refusing a direct order from Hitler had consequences. Several of Klug's colleagues had already been arrested in the aftermath of the July 20th assassination attempt. The SS was investigating everyone, so Klug ordered the attack. It failed within 48 hours. The American forces, with complete air superiority, destroyed the German armored columns in daylight. Klug, now facing encirclement himself at Falaise, began pulling his forces back without authorization. On August 15th, he wrote a final letter to Hitler. The letter, which survived the war, contained this passage, quote 9. The next day, Klug took cyanide. Model, who had stabilized the Eastern Front temporarily, was now transferred west to replace Cluj. He arrived in France in mid-August to find an army in full retreat. The front, which had been in Normandy, was now racing back toward the German border. Model's first situation report to Hitler was characteristically blunt. The front is broken. We are no longer conducting a fighting withdrawal. We are simply withdrawing. But even Model, Hitler's most trusted fireman, could not stop what was happening. The Allies were not just advancing, they were advancing everywhere at once. In the east, the Soviets had reached the Vistula River in Poland. In the west, American and British forces were approaching the German border. In Italy, the Gothic line was under pressure. In the Balkans, Romania was about to switch sides. For the German General Staff, accustomed to fighting on one or two fronts with the ability to shift reserves between them, this was the nightmare scenario. There were no longer any reserves to shift. Every sector was critical. Every commander was screaming for reinforcements that did not exist. Guderian, at his headquarters in East Prussia, spent his days in a state of controlled fury. His diaries from this period, published after the war, reveal a man watching a military catastrophe unfold while being powerless to stop it. The Soviet summer offensive had cost Germany approximately 500,000 casualties. The Western Front had cost another 300,000. These were losses that could not be replaced. Germany was running out of men. But when Guderian presented these figures to Hitler, the Führer's response was to question the numbers. "Your statistics are defeatist," Hitler told him in one meeting. "The German people are capable of far greater sacrifices than you believe." Guderian, in his memoir, recorded his response. "My Führer, I am not questioning the will of the German people. I am stating a mathematical fact. We do not have the men to replace these losses while simultaneously maintaining production in the factories." The meeting ended with Hitler dismissing Guderian's concerns, but the numbers were undeniable. By September 1944, Germany was conscripting men up to age 60 and boys as young as 16. The Wehrmacht was fielding Hard, quote, 14, composed of men with ulcers who required special diets, and Hard, quote, 15, of men who were partially deaf. These were not soldiers. These were the scrapings of the manpower barrel. In the west, Model had managed to stabilize a defensive line along the German border by September. The Allied advance, which had raced across France, had finally outrun its supply lines. The ports were still in German hands or destroyed. Fuel and ammunition were running short. Model, seeing this, allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps the Western Allies could be held at the border while reserves were gathered for a counteroffensive. But in the east, there was no such respite. The Soviet forces had paused to regroup, but intelligence reports indicated they were preparing for another massive offensive. Guderian, studying the reports, could see what was coming. The Soviets were massing forces in Poland for a drive directly into Germany. The distance from the Vistula to Berlin was less than 300 miles. If the Soviets achieved the same rate of advance they had managed in the summer, they could reach the German capital in weeks. Guderian took his concerns to Hitler on January 9, 1945. The meeting, described in detail in Guderian's memoir, began with a presentation of intelligence. Soviet forces were concentrated in the Vistula bridgeheads with overwhelming superiority. Guderian estimated they had a numerical advantage of 11-1 in infantry, 7-1 in tanks, and 20-1 in artillery. Hitler's response was to question the intelligence. Quote 16, he said. Quote 17. Guderian, his voice rising, replied, quote 18. Hitler refused. The divisions in the West were needed for the Ardennes offensive, the last-ditch counterattack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler believed that a decisive victory in the West would force the Western Allies to negotiate, freeing up forces to face the Soviets. It was strategic thinking based not on military reality, but on wishful thinking. The Ardennes offensive launched on December 16th and initially achieved surprise. But within 2 weeks it had stalled, consuming Germany's last operational reserves without achieving any strategic objective. And while those reserves were being destroyed in Belgium, the situation in the East was deteriorating by the day. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula Oder Offensive. The attack hit German positions with an artillery barrage that survivors described as apocalyptic. One German officer, later interviewed by American interrogators, said, "We had experienced Russian artillery before. This was something entirely different. The earth itself seemed to be disintegrating." The German defensive line, thinly held by divisions that were divisions in name only, collapsed within hours. Soviet tank armies poured through the gaps, advancing at speeds that stunned even their own commanders. Within 3 days, they had advanced over 60 miles. Within a week, they had reached the Oder River, less than 50 miles from Berlin. Guderian, receiving the reports at his headquarters, experienced what he later described as the lowest point of his military career. Everything he had warned about had come to pass. The Eastern Front, stripped of reserves for the failed Ardennes gamble, had simply ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. And Hitler, when informed of the situation, blamed the commanders for defeatism. The meeting between Hitler and Guderian on January 27, 1945, became legendary among the surviving staff officers who witnessed it. Guderian arrived with detailed situation maps showing the Soviet advance. Hitler, looking at the maps, began to question the accuracy of the intelligence. This was too much for Guderian. "My Führer," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "I have personally verified every piece of intelligence on these maps. The Soviets are on the Oder River. They are 40 miles from Berlin. This is not defeatism. This is reality." Hitler stood up, his face flushed. "Your reality is defeatist. The German soldier is capable of far more than your maps suggest." Guderian, according to witnesses, leaned forward over the map table. "The German soldier has performed miracles, but miracles require men and ammunition and fuel. We have none of these things in sufficient quantity." The argument continued for over an hour, with Guderian repeatedly returning to the mathematical impossibility of the situation. Germany was now fighting on 3 fronts inside its own borders. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March the 7th, capturing the bridge intact before it could be destroyed. In Italy, Allied forces were preparing for a final offensive, and in the east, the Soviets were consolidating their positions on the Oder for the final assault on Berlin. For the German generals, the situation had moved beyond military crisis into something approaching surrealism. They were being asked to defend a country that no longer had defensible borders, with an army that no longer had sufficient soldiers, using weapons and fuel that no longer existed in adequate quantities. And when they pointed out these facts, they were accused of defeatism. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, attended many of these military conferences. His memoir, Inside the Third Reich, contains detailed descriptions of the atmosphere in Hitler's bunker during the final months. Quote 25. Speer wrote, quote, 26. Model, commanding Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket, found himself surrounded in early April. The American and British forces had encircled his entire army group, cutting it off from the rest of Germany. Model, studying the situation, understood that further resistance was pointless. His soldiers were out of ammunition, out of fuel, out of food. Surrender was the only rational option. But Model was a German field marshal, and German field marshals did not surrender. On April 21, 1945, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. Before his death, he told his staff, quote, 27. In Berlin, Guderian had his final confrontation with Hitler on March 28th. The meeting, described by multiple witnesses, ended with Hitler screaming at Guderian to leave the room and never return. Guderian, his face white with suppressed emotion, saluted and walked out. He was replaced by Hans Krebs, who would be the last chief of the General Staff of the German Army. The final situation conference in the Führer bunker took place on April the 22nd, 1945. Soviet forces were in the streets of Berlin. The sound of artillery could be heard in the bunker. Hitler, studying maps that showed German units that no longer existed, issued orders for counterattacks by armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier. The generals present, according to surviving accounts, simply nodded. There was no longer any point in arguing with reality. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, later testified at Nuremberg about these final conferences. He said, the gap between what the German generals knew and what they were permitted to say had become absolute. They knew the war was lost. Many had known since the summer of 1944, when the simultaneous offensives in East and West had demonstrated that Germany was facing enemies with unlimited resources and the will to use them. Some had known even earlier, after Stalingrad or Kursk or the defeat in North Africa. But knowing the war was lost and being permitted to act on that knowledge were two different things. The Nazi system had created a situation where professional military judgment was subordinated to ideological will. And so the generals, trapped between their understanding of military reality and their oath of loyalty to Hitler, found themselves in an impossible position. Heinz Guderian, writing his memoir in the years after the war, reflected on this period with bitterness. He wrote, but Guderian also acknowledged his own complicity. He had continued to serve, continued to issue orders, continued to send men to die, for a cause he knew was lost. When asked by his interrogators why he had not resigned, Guderian's response was revealing, resignation would have changed nothing except to remove my voice from the councils of war. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that I could still influence decisions, still save lives by arguing for rational military measures. This was the tragedy of the German General Staff in the final year of the war. They were professional soldiers, trained in military science, accustomed to making decisions based on objective analysis of terrain, forces, and logistics. But they found themselves in a system where objective analysis was considered treason, where stating mathematical facts was called defeatism, where professional military judgment was subordinated to the will of a leader who had long since lost touch with reality. The statements of German generals during this period, preserved in diaries, memoirs, interrogations, and official records, reveal men caught in this impossible situation. Their words oscillate between professional military assessment and desperate attempts to convey the truth without explicitly stating it. They spoke of difficult situations when they meant catastrophe, of temporary setbacks when they meant irreversible defeat, of regrouping when they meant headlong retreat. When the Western Allies and Soviets finally met at the Elbe River in late April 1945, cutting Germany in half, the military situation had moved beyond crisis into simple dissolution. Units surrendered en masse. Officers abandoned their commands. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the war as one of history's most formidable military machines, ended it as a scattered collection of exhausted men looking for someone to surrender to. In the final days, as Berlin burned and Soviet forces closed in on the Führer bunker, the last military conferences took on a quality of dark absurdity. Orders were issued to divisions that had ceased to exist. Counterattacks were planned using forces that were already in captivity. Relief columns were dispatched from armies that had no fuel to move. And through it all, the generals who remained maintained the fiction. They saluted, they acknowledged orders, they pretended that the commands being issued bore some relationship to the reality outside the bunker walls. Because the alternative, stating the truth plainly, had become impossible. The truth was simple. Germany had been advancing everywhere at once in 1940 and 41. By 1944, the Allies were advancing everywhere at once. And the German generals, watching this reversal unfold, understood with perfect clarity what it meant. They understood that a nation cannot win a multi-front war against enemies with superior resources when those enemies have learned to coordinate their offensives. They understood that tactical skill cannot overcome strategic impossibility. They understood that the war was lost. But understanding and saying were two different things. And so they continued to issue orders, to move pins on maps, to discuss tactics and strategy for battles that would never be fought with forces that no longer existed. They did this because the alternative was to acknowledge that everything they had fought for, everything their soldiers had died for, had been in service of a cause that was not just lost, but had perhaps been unwinnable from the start. That acknowledgement would come later in prisoner-of-war camps and interrogation rooms and war crimes trials. In the moment, in the map rooms and headquarters and bunkers of 1944 and 45, the German generals did what military professionals have always done when confronted with impossible situations. They continued to do their duty as they understood it, even as that duty became increasingly divorced from any rational military purpose. The final irony was that many of these generals, in their post-war writings, blamed Hitler for the defeat while absolving themselves of responsibility. They had, they claimed, given sound military advice that was ignored. They had argued for rational strategy that was rejected. They had warned of disaster that was dismissed as defeatism. All of this was true. But it was also true that they had continued to serve, continued to execute orders they knew were based on fantasy, continued to send men to die for objectives they knew were unattainable. They had allowed their professional military judgment to be subordinated to a system that made professional military judgment impossible. And when the Allies were advancing everywhere at once, when the situation had moved beyond salvage, when the war was clearly lost, the German generals did not stage a coup or refuse orders or walk away. They continued to fight, not because they believed victory was possible, but because stopping would have required them to acknowledge that continuing was pointless. That acknowledgement, when it finally came too late. The war ended not with a strategic decision by the German High Command, but with the suicide of Hitler in his bunker and the piecemeal surrender of German forces across multiple fronts. The generals who survived would spend the rest of their lives writing memoirs that tried to explain how professional soldiers had served a regime that destroyed their profession, their army, and their country. Their words, preserved in those memoirs and interrogations, reveal the answer. They served because the alternative required a kind of moral courage that professional military training does not provide. They were taught to analyze terrain and logistics and force ratios. They were not taught how to say no to their supreme commander when saying no meant abandoning everything they had been trained to value. And so, when asked what German generals said when the Allies started advancing everywhere at once, the answer is, They said what they had always said. They gave situation reports. They discussed tactics. They issued orders. They maintained the forms of military professionalism, even as the substance had long since disappeared. They continued to play their roles in a military organization that had become a theater of the absurd, where the script bore no relationship to reality, but the actors continued their performances until the final curtain